my fellow brethren, and welcome to another episode of Motivating Monday. Today, I'll be sharing with you the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, which Jesus shared in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 to 14. This reads, "And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a Publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee, that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice a week, I give tithes of all that I possess. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For every one that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted." We see in this parable that Jesus was addressing those who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. He used the example of a Pharisee and a tax collector or publican to highlight the stark differences each of these men had when they approached God. Let's see in detail how these two men acted in front of God. For the Pharisee, he thought that he was righteous before God, and he was even so proud to proclaim this perspective to God. We see in the earlier passage that the Pharisee thanked God that he was unlike other sinners who he saw to be beneath him in terms of righteousness. He also reminded God of the things that he did for God, fasting twice a week and giving tithes to God of all his possessions. On the other hand, let's look at the actions as well as the attitudes of the tax collector. We see that the tax collector stood afar off and would not so much as to look into the heavens. From this passage, we can see that the publican was ashamed of standing before God, knowing that God was holy and righteous. The publican knew that he was not in a position to face God, and that's why he was ashamed into even looking into the heavens. We also see that the tax collector smote his breast. The tax collector probably comprehended how inadequate he was before God, as he smote his breast to express his sorrow. His request to God was simple. He acknowledged his sin and pleaded with God to forgive his sin. Let's look at the response and rationale of Jesus. Jesus tells us that the publican went home justified. What does this term justified mean? The Greek word justified means to render just, to render innocent, or righteous. This means that God had made the publican righteous when he recognized his unrighteousness. On the opposite end, we see that the Pharisee thought that he was righteous. The Pharisee thought that he was justified, but yet he was not justified before God. Let's ask ourselves this question. Was the Pharisee right in thinking that he was righteous? On the surface, yes. You can see that the Pharisee was perhaps right in thinking that he was righteous, seeing that he obeyed the Old Testament. The Pharisee mentioned that he fasted and gave tithes of all that he possessed. As a Pharisee, he was also in a position of respect and authority. The sect of the Pharisees were known to be seen as righteous. In Matthew chapter 23, verse 15, we can see that Jesus acknowledged that the Pharisees made long prayers, which perhaps garnered the admiration or respect from fellow Jews. We can also see from the same passage that the Pharisees would go so far as to compass both sea and land to convert someone to be a proselyte Jew. Of course, in this passage, Jesus was condemning the Pharisee for their practices, but on the surface, we can see that their actions seem to be righteous. Specifically for this passage, I think what the Pharisee was wrong in was in thinking that he earned his righteousness merely by obeying God's commandments. The Pharisee thought that he was entitled to God's grace because he thought he had done all that God commanded. And on top of that, his seeming obedience to the Old Testament caused him to despise his fellow Jew, a publican, who he assumed was a sinner by mere virtue of his job of being a tax collector. Let us now pause and reflect some of the key takeaways from this parable. I can think of 3 takeaways. The first takeaway is that there is nothing that we can do to claim that we have earned our salvation. Let us not be like the Pharisee in thinking that we have earned our salvation by doing God's will. Ephesians chapter 2 verses 9 to 10 tells us that we are saved by grace through faith, and not through the works that we do, lest any man should boast. Just because our faith needs to be an active faith, so it has to be backed up by actions. But these actions, in and of itself, do not earn us our salvation. We can see in Luke chapter 19 verse 10, in another parable as well, that the workers acknowledge that it is their duty to do good works by virtue of their station in life. The second key takeaway that I would like to highlight is that obedience from the heart is more important than the sacrifice we do with our hands. The parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector brings to mind the exchange between Samuel and Saul when Saul disobeyed God in wholly destroying King Agag as well as the spoils of the Amalekites. We can see that Saul wanted to sacrifice to God the spoils of war, thinking that God would find pleasure in his sacrifice. But instead, Samuel rebuked Saul by telling him that to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. I believe the Pharisee also fell into the same trap that Saul fell into by prioritizing the works that he did with his own hands instead of the genuine obedience that had to come from his heart towards God. Lastly, the last takeaway that I had be that we should not prejudge others. We should not perform God's role by judging others based on what we know of them on the surface. In the parable, we see that the tax collector was judged by his job, and the Pharisee would judge the tax collector based on the surface knowledge of what the tax collector worked as. The Pharisee certainly didn't know the tax collector personally, but yet the Pharisee thought it was perfectly fine to judge him solely on the basis of his job. Likewise, we shouldn't judge others. Let's follow the example of Paul, who was principally concerned about the state of salvation, lest he himself was found to be a castaway despite preaching to others. I hope this sharing of Luke chapter 18 verses 9 to 14 has been beneficial for you, and I'm wishing you a good week ahead. Thank you.